The night air over Callaway County, Missouri hung heavy with June heat. Crickets rasped beneath a swollen moon, and from the cabin on the edge of Robert Newsom's farm came no sound but wind pressing through warped boards. Inside, the light of a dying hearth touched iron. Chains at the foot of a bed, a chair overturned, the glint of something smoldering in the ashes. The house smelled of sweat, smoke, and fear. Celia, barely 19, stared at her hands. Her skin carried marks of years she never chose. Beyond those walls, the world called her property. Within them, a silence so deep it vibrated against her bones. She had begged. She had endured. And tonight that stillness answered itself, not with screams, but with the hush before a storm. By dawn, the master who had owned her body lay lifeless, and Celia, for the first time since girlhood, spoke only through silence. That silence would soon echo in a courtroom that tried to judge what justice meant to a woman who was never meant to have it. Missouri, mid-1850s, a nation fractured by its conscience, yet bound by law to treat human beings as possessions. The state's court still enforced codes written in the language of ownership. Any enslaved person was property. Any act against the master's will was theft, rebellion, or murder. In Callaway County, a prosperous farmer named Robert Newsom purchased Celia when she was just 14. Her exact origin is lost to record, perhaps Kentucky, perhaps from another Missouri plantation. But what emerged in every witness account is that Newsom claimed her as both laborer and sexual chattel. Over the next 5 years, she bore 2 children. Their paternity was never in question. To white neighbors, this was a quiet, respectable farm. To Celia, it was a prison where even sleep offered no refuge. Yet the law recognized no crime in the repeated assaults of a slave master. Missouri statutes, like those across much of the South, made it clear rape protections existed only for white women. Enslaved women could be violated without legal consequence because property cannot be violated by its owner. By 1855, the United States was rumbling toward civil disunion, bleeding Kansas to the west, abolitionist presses raided, and courtroom battles testing what freedom meant beneath the Constitution. Into this tension stumbled one young woman, pregnant again, desperate and exhausted beyond endurance. One night that June, when Newsom entered her cabin despite her pleas, Celia struck him once with a heavy stick from her hearth. Accounts vary on whether she meant to kill him or simply make him stop. What is certain is that his body fell, and the small fire of the hearth consumed what it could. At dawn she confessed only to her soul. Her silence broke only under interrogation, and there began the trial that would expose the monstrous logic of slavery for all to see. When Newsom disappeared, his family noticed quickly. The entire county joined the search. White farmers combing fields by torchlight, enslaved laborers ordered to hunt one of their own. It took only days. A slave named George, the father of Celia's youngest child, broke under pressure and revealed that she had confessed. Soon Celia stood before the constable, trembling, exhausted, her unborn child shifting beneath her ribs. The law moved swiftly. Celia's trial began in October 1855 at the Fulton Courthouse, a modest red brick structure whose walls still echo in state archives today. The prosecution's claim was simple. She had murdered her owner. Her defense, an argument both radical and obvious, was that Celia had acted in self-defense against continual sexual assault. Her appointed lawyers, ambitious white men sympathetic to neither her race nor her gender, nonetheless saw the case as precedent. They invoked a statute that allowed any woman to protect herself against sexual attack, arguing that this applied equally to enslaved women. It was a revolutionary assertion that law itself could recognize Celia as a woman, not a tool. The judge refused. He ruled that this section of civil protection did not cover enslaved females. The jury, all white, all male, never heard the word rape. What they heard instead was property destruction and murder. Outside the courthouse, abolitionist newspapers carried the story eastward. In Boston and Philadelphia, clergy thundered from pulpits that Missouri had exposed the soul of slavery. Inside the cell, Celia awaited her sentence, her belly swollen, her chains tightened. They hanged her that December. Her child was lost before the noose was tied. The state burned no incense for her. No prayer rose officially on her behalf. But her case entered legal textbooks, sermons, and moral reckonings. From those ashes, the storm gathered, quietly, persistently, across abolitionist circles that would soon ignite the Civil War. Celia's life reminds us that slavery waged war first upon the body, Her labor, her motherhood, her very breath, each was claimed by another. Yet the moment she lifted her hand in defense, the same system that denied her bodily ownership suddenly declared she bore moral choice. It was paradox turned cruelty. She was property when violated, human when punished. Historians identify this contradiction as the legal heart of American slavery. Court documents reveal that even pro-slavery judges privately worried about its logic. If Celia could not defend herself, they reasoned, then slavery demanded complicity and perpetual assault. Their fear was not for her safety, but for the precedent her case might set. In that single act, a desperate blow beside a fire, Celia forced Missouri to confront the question of whether enslaved women had any claim to personhood. The state's answer branded her guilty. History's answer was slower, carried by ink, sermon, and conscience. Her silence inside the cell was not emptiness. It was resistance. Enslaved women often transformed enforced quiet into prayer, coded memory, or seething focus. Within Black communities, silence after trauma carried a sacred resonance, a pause for the spirit to speak when speech would invite annihilation. Accounts from contemporaneous enslaved women often describe that hush before rebellion as the moment they heard God walking by. It wasn't vengeance but verification. What I have suffered is seen. That theological undercurrent shifted Celia's story from tragedy to revelation. Ministers in abolitionist churches would later preach her name alongside biblical women whose pain became prophecy. Tamar seeking judgment, Esther confronting a king. Her silence became sermon. The refusal to testify under the Master's law echoed as testimony under divine law. When communities retold her story, they used imagery of storms rolling across the plains, heaven answering injustice through nature itself. And indeed, the winds of national unrest were rising outside that prison. They would soon clash over faith, freedom, and womanhood in ways that bent the course of American history. Celia's children survived her hanging, though their futures remain uncertain in surviving records. Her motherhood adds yet another blade of sorrow to the structure that held her captive. Under law, any child of an enslaved woman was automatically enslaved, regardless of the father's freedom or guilt. Her very fertility extended her owner's profit. Historians estimate that by the mid-19th century, nearly 1/3 of enslaved children in border states like Missouri had white paternity. Each child's birth silently documented a crime that law refused to name. Celia's plea to spare her unborn child, petitioning the court to delay her execution until after she gave birth, was tragically practical. The court denied her request. The fetus within her was part of the property forfeited through her supposed crime. In this way, Celia's motherhood became generational armor, not to protect herself but to bear witness. Her body, transformed by violence, forced society to face the grotesque arithmetic of a system that made motherhood itself a legal contradiction. When the trial concluded, neighbors maintained polite silence. Some pitied the poor girl, others cursed the insolent slave. But within enslaved quarters across Missouri, fireside talk spread quickly. A woman had defended herself and struck her master down. In the hush of those nights, courage rearranged itself. Acts of resistance multiplied in small, unseen ways. Seeds hidden, tools vanished, prayers sharpened into plans for escape. Celia's story reached abolitionist networks through sympathetic locals and traveling preachers. By 1856, Northern papers described her case in tones of both horror and awe. Her storm was gathering. Every retelling shook another piece of moral certainty loose. Clergymen began to cite her trial when preaching about purity and justice. Lawyers referenced it when doubting the righteousness of property law. Her name became a whisper that unsettled polite society, and in the geography of history, the ground was already trembling with a deeper revolt. Soon, the very structures that condemned her, the plantations, the courts, the codes, would begin to crack. The moment of rupture was approaching. The balance of silence and storm was ready to break. The breaking point arrived not in the cabin where Celia struck her master, but within the conscience of the nation that condemned her for it. Her act forced a question that resounded far beyond Missouri's borders. Could a system survive after proving itself incapable of mercy? On the morning of her execution, December 21st, 1855, the courthouse lawn was cold, dusted with frost. Witnesses wrote of a gray sky where no wind stirred. Celia was led out from her cell barefoot, shackles glinting at her ankles. Her pregnancy, once visible, was gone. Jail records state the child had perished weeks earlier. Whether through miscarriage or deliberate neglect, the law found convenience in the outcome. A crowd gathered not in rage but in something heavier, anxious curiosity. Some saw her as a warning, others as omen. She spoke few words. None are officially preserved. A black minister stood near the gallows, praying softly that her soul would find the justice this world denied. At noon, beneath indifferent clouds, the trapdoor swung open. Her body fell, but the silence that followed did not collapse with her. Across the Midwest, abolitionist presses published accounts of her trial in their grim December editions, each headline turning courtroom notes into moral indictment. A woman condemned for defense of her honor. Historians now consider this moment a tremor in the moral architecture of slavery. The Celia case deepened the divide between pro-slavery legislators who feared reform and reformers who saw proof that the nation's legal soul was diseased. Within a year, the 1856 Republican platform would cite wrongs against womanhood and humanity in its attacks on the slave power. Her death did not end her storm. It marked its crest. The following winters, preachers across the border in Illinois invoked her story when calling the faithful to conscience. If the law would not defend the helpless, then heaven itself would intervene. And within a few short years, that invocation became prophecy fulfilled. By cannon fire, proclamation, and the slow undoing of a system once thought eternal. Celia never saw the fields turn from bondage to battle, but her silence was already marching. As historians trace the fuse that led to the Civil War, they often list the great explosions: the Fugitive Slave Act, Uncle Tom's Cabin, Dred Scott. Yet behind those headlines flickered quieter sparks, stories that pierced theology and law alike. Celia's was one. Her tragedy shook the local and national conscience in ways unmeasured by troop counts or treaties. When the news reached Northern women's societies, it ignited fierce debate. Could the language of womanhood truly be reserved for white wives and daughters while black mothers were denied the same claim to dignity? Suffragists later cited Celia as evidence that the moral struggle for women's rights and abolition were intertwined. Her case helped fuse those causes, forging alliances that would extend into Reconstruction. Even within the South, something shifted. Diaries of white women reveal unease. Entries mention the servant girl hung for striking her master, a dreadful business I cannot reconcile. In the privacy of their ink, cracks appeared in the moral armor of slavery's defenders. Some began quietly freeing servants or secretly teaching the enslaved to read scripture. Celia's death thus became a paradoxical act of creation, her silence spawning discourse. The Missouri Statesman tried to downplay the episode, calling it an unfortunate extremity. But abolitionist preachers turned that phrase upon itself, saying, "Yes, extremity indeed. The extreme proof that man's law serves only man, not the Almighty." Her name traveled on leaflets, through sermons, across border crossings where fugitives sought freedom. For those fleeing north, her story was caution and courage entwined. She could not escape, so we must. The storm she summoned gathered strength in invisible currents: conversation, conscience, conviction. By 1861, the land that had executed her erupted in a war to decide at last whether liberty had boundaries defined by color. Celia's act did not start the war, but her moral imprint runs beneath it like a tremor before the earthquake. Each year, scholars uncover reprints of her trial notes in pulpits, abolitionist meetings, even in school lessons taught by free black educators in border states. Her silence had traveled farther than her body ever could, and when emancipation came, it carried with it the echo she left behind. Proof that even a bound voice dying unheard can still summon a storm. After the war, the courthouse at Fulton still stood, solid red brick, the same walls that had once judged her. It remains an archive now, its ledgers brittle, its silence dense. Inside those files, scholars later found the depositions, the measured handwriting of men seeking to explain how a young woman's desperation could interrupt the economic order of a slave state. In the decades following Celia's execution, Missouri debated womanhood, race, and right. Yet her name rarely appeared in public memory. It was as if the record had been buried under a national effort to forget. Reconstruction demanded rebuilding. Memory threatened to reopen wounds too deep to bear. But history is stubborn. In the late 20th century, feminist historians unsealed the trial notes, and Melton McLaurin's 1989 historical study brought Celia's case to classrooms and law seminars. Universities began teaching her as more than a victim. She became a lens through which to view the contradictions of American justice. Legal scholars compared her trial with later gender-based cases, reading in her silence the origins of a long jurisprudential struggle for bodily autonomy. In African American communities, her story returned to oral tradition. Poets, theologians, and educators reframed her act not as transgression, but as testimony. Churches in Missouri and Kansas held memorial services acknowledging enslaved women who resisted abuse, Celia among them. Her name, once whispered in shadows, began to appear on plaques, curricula, and museum exhibits. Where the law denied her humanity, history reinstated it, and through that reclamation, her act of defiance shifted meaning once again, from a private rebellion to a public scripture of endurance. Each retelling drew the storm into contemporary skies, reminding a nation that the quest for justice is never fully settled, only inherited. Today, visitors to the Missouri State Archives can request Celia's file, the State v. Celia, a slave docket written in fading ink. It arrives on the desk delicately sealed, as if even paper knows it holds something sacred. Each page breathes contradiction, the voice of power preserved against the woman it extinguished, and yet through its preservation, the truth of her endurance endures. Law students cite her case as an early lens on the collision between gender and bondage. Cultural historians trace her resonance through later movements. Ida B. Wells's anti-lynching crusade, Rosa Parks's civil defiance, the ongoing insistence that black womanhood carries both double and divine burdens. Every generation that confronts injustice finds in Celia a precursory truth, that silence can possess seismic weight. In Callaway County, a marker now stands near the old courthouse. Simple, unadorned, it reads, Celia, an enslaved woman hanged 1855. Her story reveals the extreme denial of justice under slavery. Locals bring flowers. Schoolchildren listen as guides explain how law once turned away from mercy. What began as one woman's agony now functions as curriculum, memory, and mirror. Her narrative threads through literature, theology, and moral philosophy, evidence that moral progress is written in the ink of those the law once erased. Perhaps that is the true aftermath of Celia's storm. Not vengeance delivered by hand or blade, but the enduring correction of consciousness, generation by generation. Her name reforms silence into witness every time it is spoken. The storm she summoned still murmurs whenever societies debate whose bodies deserve protection, whose voices define justice. That low thunder roll beneath modern life is her legacy, and through it we recognize that the chain she broke was never only iron, but ignorance. From this enduring echo grows our last reflection, the calm that follows a righteous storm. In the end, Celia's story resolves not in fire or gallows, but in the quieter register of reckoning. Her silence, made under duress, became an enduring argument against every system that ever sought to define suffering out of existence. History often dresses progress in speeches and declarations, but change more often begins in the places where language fails. Celia's voice was denied on paper, her testimony absent from transcripts, yet her act spoke in a dialect law could not translate, one of human refusal. When words were forbidden, her stillness functioned as thunder withheld, the atmosphere tightening until justice itself changed shape. We look back and see the moral symmetry unfold. The law that silenced her became the same law compelled over time to listen. The rope, the cell, the statute, all institutions of control, now serve as exhibits in her defense. This inversion is history's form of poetic justice, the victor's ledgers turned into the victim's monument. Her life reminds us that vengeance purified of cruelty becomes something else, moral correction, restoration of balance. The storm she summoned did not roar for blood, it demanded recognition. Every reform that followed, every widening of legal and ethical imagination rings with her echo. To remember Celia is to confront the distance between legality and justice, between silence and speech, between endurance and deliverance. She stands at that crossroads still, a sentinel reminding us that justice does not always arrive announced. It gathers in quiet rooms, in conscience, in the hush, before the storm breaks again. And so this tale closes where her silence opened. Beneath a vast Missouri sky, wind pressing through the trees, reminding us that memory itself is a form of resistance.